a diverse panel of professional Scrum trainers today from all over the world that showcases the power of our Scrum.org professional Scrum trainer community. So let's get started. I want to begin by telling you a little bit about Scrum.org. We are a mission-driven company, and all of us, no matter where we are, what role we play, all of us who are affiliated with Scrum.org, we have a unifying mission that guides us, which is to improve the profession of software delivery. And this Scrum Pulse series is one of many ways in which we try to accomplish our mission. This is a free monthly webinar, which is enabled by Scrum.org. And the unifying themes that cut across all our episodes are threefold. First, we want to use these episodes and these conversations to increase the focus on empiricism and agility. We want to use these conversations and inquiries to help us create continuous delivery of business value. And finally, we want to use these episodes to help our listeners build trust and respect between business and IT. So these are some unifying themes that you will see cutting across all our episodes. So how can you plug in? How can you be part of this series? You can always register, and you can listen to these sessions live and interact with us through questions. You can also view our library of previously recorded sessions. You can go to Scrum.org Scrum Pulse, or you can watch these sessions on our YouTube channel. And most importantly, tell us what is getting in the way of improving the profession of software delivery in your unique context, and make suggestions and requests for future topics. And we'd love to get together some experts and share our thoughts on that topic. Logistics. So your microphones are going to be muted throughout the session, but we would love to get your feedback, your questions. We're going to pause at different spots during the webinar to get your questions and comments. A couple of ways in which you can interact with us. You can either tweet your questions, make sure that you mention the handle Scrum.org and the hashtag Scrum Pulse. And the other thing you can do is on your GoToWebinar panel, there's a chat box or a questions box. Please type in the questions there. We are going to be monitoring both these channels, and at different spots along the webinar, we will pause and take questions. So with that, I want to introduce our professional Scrum trainer panel from across the world. So we've got Erwin van der Koe from currently based in Australia. Erwin has got 20 years experience in software development. He's the steward of our professional Scrum Foundation training series. He's worked with companies around the world. So welcome, Erwin. We have Josh Partogi, currently also based in Australia. More than 15 years in software development, more than 7 years in agile training and coaching. And Josh has got, although he's a software developer, he has a deep interest in psychology and anthropology. From India, we welcome NAGESH Sharma. NAGESH has got 12 plus years in product development, 5 plus years in agile training and coaching, and an ICF certified life coach, innovation champion and learning champion. And finally, from the great state of Texas in the USA, we've got Mark Noneman. Mark Noneman is managing partner in Madison Henry, 20 plus years in software development and 15 plus years in agile training and coaching. So we have really talented and diverse set of panelists who have experience in dozens of countries and cultures around the world. Will be sharing their insights and anecdotes. So welcome. So some caution about how to listen, or a place from which to listen, and how to apply what you hear in today's session. The first is, culture does not explain everything, and we must use culture cautiously. So our advice and request to you is, please avoid the trap of using culture for stereotyping or generalizing. And in today's episode, we want to focus on increasing the awareness and appreciation of our cultural differences. We want to have the courage to have a delicate conversation, and we want to be open to other views of thinking. Every culture has a unique perspective. There's no black or white, and it's interesting to see how different people, different cultures view and respond to similar situations. Finally, we want respect for these different perspectives, diversity of thoughts and cultural norms. And our commitment is that this conversation should help us improve the profession of software delivery and enable the ethical and sustainable delivery of business value. So my ask is, please keep this kind of front and center as you're listening or as you're trying to apply what you learned in this session. So with that, I want to hand over to Erwin, and Erwin is going to walk us through Hofstede's cultural dimensions theory. So Erwin, over to you.
Thank you, Ravi. Yeah, I wanted to sort of talk to you about a model I found quite a while ago that's been very useful for me. I'm quite familiar with sort of relatively different cultures, but it wasn't until I started working abroad that I sort of realized that just how different cultures can be, even in sort of organizations. And that's where a model like Hofstede has been really useful for me personally, to sort of start figuring out in what ways cultures can be different. And so when we're talking about this model, this is there's a lot of research being done sort of how national cultures are different. So this has been really useful for me. And sort of Hofstede is a Dutch researcher actually, who's done a lot of research about sort of how different cultures look at things differently. So to quickly sort of go through those, one of those axes in sort of how cultures are different is in their view on sort of individualistic or collectivistic, right? So are we talking about us or is it me? Right, and that's how that sort of makes a massive group, massive difference in how sort of we see groups. So, for example, when I was in the U.S., that's very much a sort of individualistic society. And if you look at sort of in general to the more across sort of Asia, I see there's a lot of more sort of the sort of us is much more important. And as Ravi was saying before, this isn't sort of not useful to use to sort of talk about individuals, but it's great to sort of figure out sort of what the average, what the standard is in these countries. Masculine, feminine is very much more sort of what's important, right? And masculine societies are much more about confrontation and about sort of decisiveness, and feminine are much more about sort of how do we get consensus and sort of get along. And this was one of those things that was very hard for me personally, because the Dutch are famous for sort of trying to sort of basically making compromise. Right? That's sort of how we get along, and sort of we compromise everything, which is sort of to a point. There's no right or wrong in either of these things, right? They're the way they are, and they're different. There's not to say that masculine is better than feminine or the other way around. But when you sort of not used to these sort of different things, it can be kind of confronting. The other one that's very, very funny for me is the thing called uncertainty avoidance. And you can find out the level of uncertainty avoidance a country has by just riding on their highways. I'm from Europe, and sort of driving through sort of Germany and especially Switzerland, these are countries with a high amount of uncertainty avoidance, and everything will always be perfectly signposted. And so you can drive along the highway, and there's perfect signposts, and you always get to wherever you are. And it's very different when I was living in the Caribbean. No signs, nothing. You're probably not where you're going, right? And so that's that uncertainty avoidance. But one of the most important things I found that's a factor in sort of that organization, that culture in organizations, is what they call power distance. And that's basically how important hierarchies is. And so people with a low power distance, or cultures with a low power distance, see their manager as someone with a different role, not so much someone with a lot of control. And this is one of the things I find to be the biggest influencer of the sort of cultural misunderstanding. So the most influencer of cultural is sort of how do people perceive hierarchies. And then there's sort of the long-term perspective and the short-term perspective, right? And that's sort of what's the planning horizon of sort of most people. Do we care about the long-term future and our legacies, or are we talking about the here and now? Again, that was a valuable lesson of my sort of year and a half I spent in the Caribbean, where long-term planning is what we're going to have for dinner tonight. And the last one is sort of the indulgence and restraint. I haven't found an awful lot of use for this particular one in corporate cultures, so I don't want to go into a lot of details around it. So one of the most important things to take away from this model is it's useful to take a look at the numbers. If you go to Van Hofstade's website, you can look up the different sort of countries, and you can find out sort of what they score on average in any of these measures. But what I find most important is not so much what the individual numbers are, but the fact that cultures are different. You have to compensate. There's sort of these pillars that we're talking about, and then there's also a lot of the there's a lot of sort of rituals and sort of saying and rules that sort of flow about these. So yeah, when we're talking about sort of Scrum, how do we get the most out of our multicultural teams? By far the most important thing is to sort of have that openness to other cultures, the fact that they can be changed, and to respect that. Like, there's no right, there's no wrong. They're just different than what you're used to.
Very cool. Thank you so much, Erwin, for giving us that kind of foundation and an opportunity to kind of look at Scrum and our differences in our Scrum team through the lens of these 5 pillars. So with that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to segue into our anecdotes and insights, and we'll begin with Josh. So Josh, can you share your most insightful anecdote about working with multicultural Scrum teams?
Okay, thank you, Ravi. So one of the most insightful anecdote is when I had this experience working with Japanese teams and Filipino teams. So it was actually a French company with a business presence in Japan, and they have a development team in the Philippines. At that time, I didn't have much experience working with the Japanese. So I thought that all Asian cultures are relatively the same. So a lot of assumptions was made about the Japanese culture. I did not realize that the two cultures are very different. One example is I found out that the Japanese is very reserved, while the Filipinos, they're very open and they're very talkative. So I found out about this during sprint retrospective. The team from Japan did not talk a lot, and because the retrospective was held remotely, I could not really feel the emotion of the Japanese team, and a lot of assumptions was made at that time. Why are they so silent? Why aren't they involved in this retrospective? Until at one point I had an opportunity to go to Japan and meet the Japanese team and had a chat at a bar. So the Japanese are actually very open if you meet them at a bar and drink together. So there they share why they were very reserved during retrospective. And one of the things that I found out was they were not really confident with their English. So because that was the case, I found out something new. So it taught me a new lesson how to facilitate the retrospective between these two different cultures. So after that conversation at a bar with the Japanese team, I bring up the two teams together and show them the Scrum values, because even the Scrum values can be seen differently from different cultures. So I asked them about the Scrum core values, both the Filipino team and the Japanese team. How do they see commitment? Do they see commitment as just meeting the deadline? What does it mean to them? What does courage mean to them? Does it mean it's about being blunt? What does focus mean? Does it only mean it's working as planned only and not doing and not agile and adaptive to work that wasn't planned before? What does respect mean? Does it mean that you only respect people from your own culture? Because the Japanese they're very strong with people from their own ring. And then how does openness mean to them? Does it mean that you're open with your feeling? Because I found out that the Filipinos, they're very much open. And then I also asked them about how do they see the other elements in Scrum, like how do they view ambiguity, how do they see failures, and how is servant leadership? Does leadership must be a top-down approach, or is servant leadership seen as a bad thing? The Japanese are very strong in hierarchy, so I also asked about hierarchy. How does the Japanese team view hierarchy, and how does the Filipino teams see hierarchy? So by bringing these core values, I expect them to be on the same page. Can you show the next slide, Ravi?
Sure.
So by asking both parties about the core values, because it brings people together to the same perspective, it will create a safe environment for them to explore how cultural differences might impact.
Very good.
That's all from me.
Thank you, Josh. So I want to pause here, see if there are any comments from our panelists or if there are any questions from the attendees for Josh. Okay. If not, we will move on to our next anecdote, and this is coming from Nagesh. So Nagesh, tell us your story.
Thank you so much, Ravi, and also Josh for sharing great insight, as well as Eric. So my anecdote is how culture impacts the distributed agile environment, and I've been predominantly working on teams with India, Netherlands, and Israel. And what I have seen is that culture comes the last, because culture can eat the strategy for breakfast. What comes first is the belief of the people, and there's a particular business unit in which I was working on, which did not have a belief that it is possible to create a working software in 30 days or less, and because of which they were lacking a lot of coordination, communication, and collaboration culture inside their teams. So the first challenge for me as a transformation coach in this particular team was to have the belief in the people, because when I saw that helping the teams to create at least a single piece of functionality, then it started showing up in the behavior of the people. That means that they started experimenting, and that behavior led into certain patterns. So, and the pattern of having focus towards the time boxes, having openness in their thoughts, showing courage and saying that what is possible, what is not possible, having the commitment, sticking to the sprint goal, and respecting each other's values and opinion. And that slowly started leading into a habit of winning, that habit of creating a software at the end of every sprint, which meets the quality, and then reaps the culture. So that's when I discovered this small concept, which I say it is belief that drives the behavior, and behavior leads to certain patterns, and patterns manifest into habits, and ultimately habits reap into the culture. So if you want a culture of creating a working software at the end of every sprint, then the first thing what I would recommend is to have a belief in place as a seed that yes, it is possible to create a working software 30 days or less. Ravi, could you please move to the next one, next bullet?
Okay, very good. So,
thank you. And you can see a small sketch note depicting that particular simple step, which helps creating that belief. You visit each other more often, taking more important decisions together, collaborate, and kick on together. This is a very effective way in which starting Scrum teams, how are we going to work together? What are our values? What is our vision? Why are we here? What is the purpose of our team? And then definitely celebrate our experiments, and then ultimately it comes to the trust. So my most valuable insight would be that unifying the accountability of Scrum teams is culture agnostic. So, and I also see that Scrum Masters are the DNS of the culture. They are the guardians of culture, which stands on the 5 Scrum values ultimately: focus, openness, respect, courage, and commitment. So they must rise above the cultural differences to deliver incremental value, maximizing the opportunities for the feedback. That's what I wanted to say, and I would love to hear some questions or comments if there are any.
very good. Nagesh, thank you so much. It really resonated with me what you just mentioned, that the underlying belief systems are beneath the surface and they're invisible. But if as a coach, in a compassionate way, we surface those invisible underlying belief systems, then we can influence, intentionally help the teams choose the behaviors, patterns, and habits, and shape the culture which will influence the outcome. So very powerful. I also like what Josh was saying, which might play in this situation, to piggyback off of your ideas. If you create a safe environment where people can surface how culture impacts their belief systems, it can help us understand and appreciate each other. So Nagesh, thank you for sharing that story and for the visual. Reminder to attendees, a couple of ways in which you can share your thoughts, comments, questions. You can use the question panel on your GoToWebinar panel, and you can type in some questions or comments. And you can also tweet your questions. Make sure you mention the handle Scrum.org and the hashtag ScrumPulse. So let me take a look at the panel, see if we have any questions. And panelists, if you have any observations or thoughts, please feel free to raise them at this point as well.
Yeah, the thing I just wanted to sort of call out as bloody brilliant was sort of Josh's how do we interpret the Scrum values, because it's one of those things that I've learned is we all assume those values to be self-evident, and everyone sees them as self-evident, and they're very much clouded by the sort of culture that you've grown up with. So yeah, it's one of those very, very interesting exercises that I'm gonna going to do with my next sort of multicultural teams is sort of explore some of the values that underlie Scrum, and I can only sort of encourage other people to give that a try as well.
Very good. So Nagesh, I have a question from Scott. Is there one incident or an example that comes to mind in terms of how you coached these teams with different cultures?
Yeah, thank you, Scott, for the question, first of all. So one example which readily comes to my mind is that this is what was happening, and there is a team, distributed team, having a couple of folks in Haifa, Israel, and couple of folks in India, and couple of folks in Netherlands. Very typical. One Scrum team with distributed members across the globe. And it was extremely difficult for the folks to do their Scrum events, and they were finding it very difficult. And so the question came to them was to the Scrum Master, saying that, do we really need to have a daily Scrum every day? Because we are across the different locations, can't we just look into the emails and do the stuff? So one of the things tactics which I used was to have all the people together and remind them of the purpose of what is the purpose of having a daily Scrum, and why do we need to have it in the first place. And that kind of ignited a lot of thoughts in people's minds, saying that, okay, our purpose is to ensure that how well we together are progressing towards one common vision, one common goal, and that is at the end of the day to create a releasable software at the end of every sprint. And for us to have that in place, what do we need to do? How well do we need to collaborate? How well do we need to communicate? And then it was awesome, because we need to just be a catalyst and just give some air and people catch fire. That's what I have experienced, Ravi.
Very good. Thank you, Nagesh. There is another question coming in, but I'm going to wait until the end. It's a really powerful question. So about how do you rebuild respect and trust in a team once it is lost, and any examples. So it's a really good question. Let's hold that to the end. And what I'd like to do now is to transition over to Erwin. So Erwin, tell us your story.
Yeah, so this is one of those things where sort of Hofstede's thing has sort of helped me. So the scenario that we're talking about is I was working for a large Dutch bank, and all of our software was development was most of it was outsourced to India, and this is where I ran into sort of a lot of issues in that sort of cultural aspects, and this is sort of made worse by sort of company culture. Right? We're not talking just sort of national culture, we're talking company cultures as well, where there was strict hierarchies, sort of doing as you're told, and I found it very, very hard to get self-organization going in these teams, because I was used to my Dutch teams, and sort of self-organization comes quite naturally to us. Listening to other people's opinions, not so much, but so that's the sort of yin and the yang. It's about that balance. So I was used to sort of giving teams the freedom to do what they wanted, and that completely backfired when I sort of tried to do that with the Indian colleagues that we have. So that's when we sort of hit that bump. That's when I decided to bring a few team members per team sort of on site. Right? So we flew in a bunch of the people from India, flew them to the Netherlands, and we were in a position where we had two people on the team were in the Netherlands, and sort of 5, 6, 7 people, depending on the team, were back in India. And that's when I got a sort of much better view into sort of how these people thought and what their values were. And this is where the interesting thing happened is that power distance that I was talking about. I became aware of that, just how important hierarchy and status was for these people. And so the trick that I used there is I had a lot of formal authority. I was the boss. I was running things. I was responsible for a lot of the outcomes. So I used my formal authority to basically not say anything and leave it up to the team. So so yeah, it's that sort of counterintuitive thing is sort of being aware of that that sort of power distance. I was able to use my formal authority to sort of get these teams to self-organize, to create the room for these people to self-organize, and that's sort of where sort of on the long run we made a massive transition to proper self-organizing teams. So at the beginning it was sort of asking them for input, and there's a slow transition. In the beginning it was asking them for input and still making the decisions. And once they were comfortable with sort of giving me advice, I gave them sort of more and more to do, up until the point where I was like, well, you guys are responsible for the decisions. I will only approve them. And that's where a lot of the magic happened, right? It was still up to me to approve the decisions. That sort of kept that hierarchy in place. But they felt comfortable in sort of sharing and sort of self-organizing. So it was one of those things where being aware of sort of those cultural differences, I was able to make a massive shift in attitude. And for me, one of the most hilarious things was when the team was given a big architecture document to write. They had to come up with the architecture of a new platform, and they were a bit nervous about it. And but I refused to tell them what it should look like, so they came up with something, and they presented this, asking if this was what I wanted, what I would have sort of done, and I could seriously say, like, nope, this is certainly not what I would have come up with. It's a whole lot better. Right? And that's sort of where I was able to sort of get this team that was trying to do what I wanted to turn into a real proper self-organizing team. And that's some of the powerful respect, respecting cultural differences is vital.
Very good. Thank you, Arvind. As I was listening to you as an Indian, born and raised in India, I got transported to my childhood kindergarten, and I was just, I was reflecting. I never thought of my experiences in that perspective until you just spoke. That as Indians, at least maybe I should not generalize, but my experience as an Indian is we put a lot of emphasis on respect for elders, and
yep.
And what happened is,
which is certainly not a bad thing, right? It's really
yes,
really
nothing,
good thing.
Not a bad thing. Yes, not a bad thing at all. And yeah, but what happens? What's interesting is in school, or I was watching my sister in her dance class in India. She used to go to a dance class called Kathak, and watching my daughters in America go to ballet class and observing the differences in the dynamics between the student and the teacher, or with the elders.
Yep.
It was interesting. So, and what I think as I was listening to you was the respect for elders and listening to elders and the desire to keep the elders happy. I think when we go to a professional setting, the parent or the teacher, maybe that relationship gets shifted to the boss, and then maybe that has a role in playing in enabling or inhibiting self-organization. So very powerful anecdote. Arvind, thank you so much. And some of the questions, maybe this is a good time for us to explore a question from Heidi, and either Arvind, you could take it, or any of the other panelists could take it. What is have you noticed any patterns or insights when it comes to rebuilding lost trust and respect, and how different cultures prefer to handle that situation? So what do you do if the trust or respect is lost in a team? Is there any example that you might have from your experiences on how that can be rebuilt if you look at it through the prism of cultural differences?
Yeah, I can definitely talk to that. It certainly has happened to in some of the teams I'm working with. Again, this is mostly sort of European teams on and sort of Indian teams, but even in sort of Western and sort of Eastern European. So how do you rebuild the respect and trust? There's one surefire way that I've almost always that has never failed me, and that is to get people to eat together. Best thing that's worked for me every single time. Get the teams together and get them eating together. If you can get them to prepare food together, that's even better. But there's something absolutely magical about sitting together and sort of eating and drinking together. It's out of words. It's pure. It's absolutely magical in sort of building a trust and respect. Getting people in a room. It doesn't really work very well across time zones. But yeah, if you can get teams together, get them talking, get them sort of eating, drinking, and sort of cooking together, it's been one of those absolutely magical things for me. You learn so much about people, and you see them as people, not as them. So that's my sort of top tip.
Very cool. Thank you so much, Irvin, and that kind of mirrors my experience. And one of my students mentioned the same thing, that she had a distributed team, and she would organize on a bi-weekly cadence or some cadence. They would just eat together because that humanizes each other. So you turn on the webcam and you have a cup of virtual coffee or a virtual snack or lunch, depending on what time it is in your locale. And the only rule was
I've never actually tried it remotely. That's an awesome idea, actually. I love that. That idea.
Yeah, and the only rule was that you can't talk about work. So just maybe the neurons change when we start eating, and then we forget about our emails and stress, and we just connect to each other as human beings. So that's a great idea. So Irvin, thank you, and Heidi, thank you for that question.
Yep.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to Mark. So Mark, tell us your story.
Thanks, Ravi. I have a couple of stories that are related here. First, I worked many years ago when I was first beginning to work with Scrum with a team in Ireland, in Dublin, Ireland. And I was actually the manager of this team, and I would travel there and work with them as they started to learn to build a backlog and execute the Scrum events and things of that nature. I learned pretty quickly after a couple of sprints that the team struggled a lot with this idea of transparency. And what would happen was we'd get to the end of the sprint and they would show me the done work. And I noticed very quickly that they only had done work. They never had work that was never completed. And I could remember when we would do planning, they had planned to do other items that did not even appear at the sprint review as having been started or partway completed, and was not also done. When I was, after a couple of sprints of this, and I asked them about that, they confided in me that any work that was not done, they simply took out of the plan and they removed it and would not discuss it as anything they had planned to do. So when I suggested this was going to cause some challenges in understanding how much work they could actually do in the sprint, they explained to me that it was not acceptable for them to have anything that was not completed. And so it was really a sort of a cultural challenge for that team and that environment to have said they would do something and then be embarrassed that they hadn't actually completed it. Now, a few years later, I worked with another team in Ireland as an Agile coach, and this team had a very different attitude, a very different behavior. They had worked together for a long time, and they had a management team that had been able to demonstrate, sort of show the value of openness and be willing to say, it's perfectly fine that you started some work and didn't finish it. Let's understand what happened about that. Let's learn from that, and let's use that going forward so we can know how much work we can do in a sprint. So even though in this particular case in Ireland, they had struggled with some transparency issues, it did vary from team to team. In another case, I had a team in Russia that I was working with, and going back to the Hofstede model that Erwin talked about, if you look at the cultural dimensions between the United States and Russia, you'll see they're almost diametrically opposite in almost every dimension, with the exception of masculinity. All the other 5 dimensions, they're virtually polar opposites from each other. And in this particular team in Russia, the team members really struggled with self-organization. They wanted management to tell them what to do, and they were horrified at the idea that they could decide on their own what they needed to do. Now, having said that, you might, if you study Russian culture, you might expect that behavior. But in about that same time frame, I worked with a team in the state of Ohio in the United States, and they had exactly the same behavior because of the culture of the organization for that particular company. The team really was afraid to not do what the boss said, and furthermore, believed that the boss would override anything that they decided to do on their own. So really the same behavior in a very dramatically different national culture perspective. So I think my takeaway from this, the key insight really is that I think it's true that national culture may predispose an organizational culture, but it isn't deterministic. It's not fate. It doesn't have to be that way. I think at the end of the day, it really comes down to the specific people that are involved in any Agile team, and how management views we're back to the values of Scrum, which I think is an excellent way to think about this and sort of explore cultural differences, not only national cultural differences, but organizational culture. How do different teams view these different values? And it'll come down to the specific people involved, both from a management perspective and from a team perspective. How do they view these values of Agile and values of Scrum? So I think that's what I have to say on this topic.
Very cool. Thanks, Mark. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because one might be led to the conclusion that national or ethnic culture trumps organizational culture, but it's interesting that you mentioned that may not always be the case. And in fact, one of the organizations I was coaching, there are 6 different, I think, towers, and there are 3 locations. There's Poland, there is India, and there is Dallas. But I started noticing the pattern that one of the organizations had a very inspiring leader, and no matter which city or country I went to, I found a lot of inspired, motivated team members at every level who had the courage to take risks, to make mistakes, and to learn. And that organizational culture transcended the national and ethnic cultures of 3 different countries and 3 different continents. So that's very interesting. Let me pause here. does anyone have questions or comments about what the story that Mark shared? So again, feel free to put questions in the chat window or the questions panel, and also on Twitter. Okay.
Well, while we're doing that, can I just sort of make sure that sort of Mark's point isn't lost? Because yes, while we're talking about sort of national cultures, they help shape company cultures, but they're definitely not the end all. And even corporate cultures don't sort of shape the sort of values of the individuals in organizations, right? So it's very easy to sort of overgeneralize and sort of abuse it. So yeah, I sort of one of the stories that sort of Mark triggered in me was another Indian company. I was actually listening to a conference talk at Agile India a couple months ago, and it was a company that was talking about how they applied lean startup principles, and I didn't have an awful lot of other talks to go to, so I decided to humor myself and sort of figure out how Indians would sort of never really be able to sort of get the lean, sort of try and experiment and fail. My notion, I'm probably scared at this time because I should have known better. It was how the big Indian company sort of completely embraced startup. Their CEO was on board. He startup. He had talked to sort of got every over there. They were doing amazing, absolutely amazing things with lean startup and trying of new things. So even if you're aware of these cultural differences, it's very easy to fall into that trap of stereotyping. Even though in general things might be true, it's very easy to fall into the trap to assume that it's true in the small, and that's definitely not always the case.
Very cool. Yep, Erwin, thank you for amplifying that point, that it's so complex. There are so many influences, and it's tempting to oversimplify and generalize. But again, none of these things in isolation can explain our behavior, any one of our behaviors. It's interesting to be aware of many different influences and belief systems that might be impacting how a person responds to any given situation, which may be different from the way you might respond. But as Erwin mentioned, there's no right or wrong. They're just different. So with that, I want to start wrapping up. And the key points that we wanted you to consider as you look back at this conversation, that one of the key points is that culture does not explain everything. We must be cautious. And as Erwin mentioned, we must avoid the trap of using culture for stereotyping. As Josh mentioned, one practice that we might consider is to create safety and allow team members to explore how cultural differences impact their interpretation and application of Scrum values, which leads us to what Nagesh was saying, that there are some hidden belief systems which lead to behaviors and patterns and habits that shape the organizational culture. But we should never forget that no matter where we come from, when we are on a Scrum team, we have one unifying accountability, the true vision, the true north, which is deliver incremental value and maximize feedback and learning. And as Erwin mentioned, sometimes you might have to use counterintuitive coaching. So you may have to use formal authority to give people permission to self-organize. And last but not the least, remember what Mark said, which is one may be tempted to reach the conclusion that that national or ethnic culture trumps organizational culture, but that may not always be the case, because You may be in completely different geographic regions, but you might see certain patterns and behaviors that transcend the boundary because the organizational culture is so strong. So we have some recommended resources, suggestion from Mark to read the book Reinventing Organizations. I would strongly recommend that you download and print out the Scrum Values poster. It's available on the Scrum.org site. And I would really recommend that you watch this video by Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland, the co-creators of Scrum, where they explain why they made the recent changes to the Scrum Guide to reintroduce the Scrum values and what each of these values meant to them. So with that, I'd love to take a couple of questions. We are approaching the end of our time box. You can again type in your questions. You can on the chat panel or the questions panel on the GoToWebinar, and you can also tweet your questions with the handle Scrum.org and the hashtag ScrumPulse. So I'd like our panelists to answer your questions, and we have a follow-up from Scott while we are waiting for other questions. So Josh, there's a question from Scott. So as you were trying to enable the conversation between your Scrum teams to help them understand each other's perspective on the Scrum values, did you give what was the mechanics of that conversation? Did each team member share with other team members what the Scrum values meant to them, or can you share some of your tips on how to facilitate that kind of a conversation?
Oh, thank you, Ravi. So no, because the Japanese were quite reserved, so it was like a closed. Like I asked everyone like to write it down. And then it's closed format, so they don't like open it up and they don't say it verbally. So they handed out to me how they view the Scrum values, and then I saw that it was very different. They have a very different perspective about Scrum values. Then I have to explain to them what the Scrum values really were, because they had different interpretation about Scrum values.
And in terms of the language barrier, I had a couple of experiences. One was I was coaching a team in a city called Saltillo in Mexico, and another one was I was working with another fellow professional Scrum trainer, and I was kind of coaching their team in I think Lima in Peru. And sometimes it helps to have some people who are, in many cases that I had, because I can't speak Spanish, I had an interpreter, right? So there was somebody that they trusted and respected, and they would speak in the language that they were comfortable in. And it created safety, because the challenge with the language, and I struggle with it myself because I think in Hindi, but I speak in English, and I have sometimes I struggle because I have to run an interpreter. But if you take that complexity out and give a person the freedom to express their feelings and thoughts in the language that comes naturally to them, and then have somebody else translate, then that may reduce a barrier to communication. So Josh, thank you for sharing that example. And last question before we wrap up, we have a question from Andrea. Is it possible to tweak Scrum to better fit cultural differences? Example, high hierarchy and low hierarchy, or high power distance, low power distance. So would any of the panelists like to share their thoughts on Andrea's question?
This is Mark. I have some thoughts about that. I would say that for the Scrum framework, I would say you don't want to make any changes in the framework itself. That is to say, the roles, the events, the artifacts of Scrum, the rules, sprints have to be 30 days or less, for example, 1 month or less. Those are not things that you should be changing from a cultural perspective. However, and those are the fundamentals of the framework, and if you change them, you're not doing Scrum anymore. But having said that, cultural differences will drive you to do many of the events, to execute them in different ways. Josh relayed the story of the retrospective. Scrum requires that we have one, but how you do one effectively in different cultures might be very different. I worked with a team, wasn't Japanese, but similar behavior that Josh expressed, where they just did not want to be open with each other. They did not have a lot of trust. It was a new team. And so to do the retrospective, we had them anonymously submit areas that they felt were not working very well. And that way we could discuss them without attributing them to specific context or to specific individuals. So I think the way you execute the different events and different practices that you use definitely have to adjust them based on culture, but let the Scrum framework be Scrum.
Can I add some things?
Sure,
If you're working with a multicultural team, I've learned that like there's a saying that when you're in Rome, you have to act like the Romans. So it's very important, it's very critical for the Scrum Master to really understand both cultures, because you act like the anchor for the multicultural team. By being fluid and being flexible, you will gain trust from all of these multicultural team members. So it's very important for the Scrum Master to learn and understand the local cultures from both sides. That's what I've learned.
Very good.
Can I just add? Ravi, I want to add something in very brief, and supporting what Mark and Josh said just now. I too believe that Scrum Master is like a thermostat, should be able to read the temperature of the room. There was one experience in which I have seen that one team member being really, really silent because of some kind of barrier, because not being outspoken, sitting in a distributed location, and most of the team members in India were quite loud and quite participative. And this was a time when the Scrum Master did something amazing, which I really liked, and that has been in my mind. The Scrum Master said that this is the time when we are going to talk about our emotions, folks. Let us change the way we are doing retrospective this time, and everybody talks about emotions. What made you happy last sprint? What was the saddest part which happened to you? And then what surprised you pleasantly? And what I have seen is suddenly that person started speaking out, right? So in that way, it was really helpful, and I think those are the mechanics behind. And I totally believe that what Mark said, we need to keep the principles and values live.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, folks. So I wanna respect our time box. So we have just 1 minute left. So guys, this is a fascinating topic. 60 minutes is not enough. So I think today we touched just the tip of the iceberg. I would love for you to continue the conversation by posting these questions and thoughts on our Scrum.org community forums. I also would love to have you guys read the articles from our professional Scrum trainers. So today in this panel, you just got a taste of the power and wisdom of our professional Scrum trainer community. Many more nuggets of wisdom on our blog. So please do take time once in a while to go and visit our blog and share your thoughts. And just a reminder that we exist to improve the profession of software development and delivery. We cannot do this by ourselves. So we want you to join our community in whatever form that calls you and inspires you. And hope to see you in future sessions. Thank you so much for your engaged participation. If this was valuable, spread the word, watch our videos, and get a cup of coffee or food and watch one of our sessions in your distributed Scrum teams and have a conversation. So with that, I want to thank all of our panelists and organizers, and I want to thank the attendees. Have a good day or good evening, good night, and have a great weekend. And I look forward to seeing you at our next Scrum Pulse. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi.